U.S.-Russia relationship and what's going on right now in Eastern Europe. There's been a lot of development since we last covered it on the show. The two main flashpoints right now, of course, are the border between Belarus and Poland, and then Ukraine and Russia, where there's a lot of talk about, potential action and different kinds of warfare. But to start off, and I think the really good way to outline generally what's going on here is by what Putin said, in that Western powers are taking Moscow's red lines too lightly. And so rather than understanding that, military ties with Ukraine and bringing Ukraine into NATO is a red line for Russia. So the border between Russia and Ukraine is too long, and to have that kind of NATO military power and constantly threatening Russia is just too much for Russia to handle. And so that's a red line, and they've been very clear about that. And so what has the U.S. done? It's, built up ties to an insane level with Ukraine, and more on that in a minute. But another thing that has really brought a lot of current issues between NATO and Russia is the issue in Belarus, where there's a bunch of migrants on the border looking to cross into Poland, and the UK, the US, Poland, particularly the Baltic states, but any country in NATO has been condemning this. And one of the really interesting things that nobody is talking about, Connor, is that these migrants are from Iraq, Syria, the Middle East, right? And so even if Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, is facilitating and helping them get to the border and, letting them into Poland, there's a reason they want to leave their countries in the first place that nobody is talking about. And if the Western rhetoric on the migrants in Belarus was replaced with the migrants in, Central America coming to the United States, it would be condemned as racist, like instantly, and Trumpian. And it's absolutely unbelievable how many liberal media outlets have just condemned Belarus over this. Also, how much they've kind of trumped up what's happening. I read this article from the New York Times about how the migrants were destroying the pristine forest in the area, and they were showing pictures of the trash left on the ground. It's like 3 shirts. It would have taken the photographer less time to pick up the clothing that was left behind than to take the pictures. There wasn't that much there, and they're making a lot out of this and trying to play up the threat. And it's just so obvious. But things have kind of simmered down. Belarus reached out to the EU even after they had sanctions put on them. The EU put on another round of sanctions, by the way. But then Belarus reached out and they said, hey, we would like to engage in talks. That was actually rebuffed by the EU. I'm not sure why. It would seem to me that, talks in this case would actually make sense, but they said no. Then they put on sanctions. But then Poland's president says that there's no military threat at the border with Belarus. And this seems to be the first sign that, we're starting to have maybe a ramp down in tensions. And then Belarus pulled, I think, like 250 migrants off of the border and put them in like a warehouse. It honestly was a far better situation than pictures that I've seen of U.S. migrant facilities, to be quite honest. But, that might have just been like a government propaganda pick, and then they're going to put them in squalor after they, take this one nice picture. But they also sent 400 of the migrants, and remind you, there's like 4,000 to 5,000 in total, I think is what we're talking about numbers here, back to Iraq. So this has started to relieve the tension on the border between Belarus and Poland. And it seems like, at least for now, Connor, that this isn't going to continue to be a major flashpoint for NATO and Russia. However, that doesn't mean that they're not ramping up tensions on about what's happening with Ukraine. So I would say the last time we covered this on the show, one of the things that we had discussed was actually that Western powers, the U.S., NATO countries, not Ukraine, were far more hawkish about the Russian troop movements than the Ukrainian generals were. Well, Ukraine got the message. The grift is on, and they're now looking for weapons and training from the U.S. I believe it was their defense minister who recently made a trip to the U.S. and said that he wanted more military assistance from the U.S. and they're looking for more weapons and stuff like that, but also more training. And this is oh yeah, what's the big deal about training, Kyle? Well, this means we're sending more special operations forces to Ukraine. Also, the Ukrainian military is infested with neo-Nazis, and we probably shouldn't be, having our troops embedded with those guys. It's provocative towards Russia. And also, if we are making the Ukrainian military more effective fighters, that could spur them to be more hostile in the, regions of Ukraine that are currently separate and in rebellion from the Ukrainian government, which could provoke more fighting with Russia. So, it's concerning that Ukraine is asking for all this. What's I think more concerning is that apparently, as of today, just before we went on, Connor, I read, and this is from Natasha Bertrand at CNN, so put a big asterisk by it. This may just be hawkish rhetoric from people inside the administration, but the U.S. is apparently considering sending extra weapons and what they said are advisors, but troops to Ukraine in response to what they say is a Russian military build-out in a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is something that, U.S. officials are actually worried about, which seems absurd. But, they're not just talking about like sending more Javelin missiles or Mark IV patrol boats, Connor. They're talking about sending things like Mi-17. These are the helicopters that were actually, I guess they were going to give or repairing for the Afghan army. Talking about sending them, or even Stinger missiles. Like, giving Stinger missiles to a group hasn't been problematic in the past and didn't lead to some unintended consequences decades down the road. But, all this is very important. And one of the things that I think is a real problem with what the U.S. is doing here is the evidence I don't think backs up that there's likely going to be a Russian invasion. If you look at the size of the force on, that they're talking about in the military buildup, which isn't on the Ukrainian border, like they don't have tanks overlooking the border or anything that, I think the imagery that goes into people's heads. But the military buildup is even smaller than the military buildup that was used, or that there was, in April of this past year. And so if there wasn't an invasion then, there's unlikely to be one now. Also, the military buildup could be in response to Ukraine unrolling new technology, including drones they bought from Turkey, and of course the U.S. Javelin anti-tank missiles, and attacking more targets in the Donbass region of the break off separatist region of Ukraine. And so, Russia could be building up its military, fearing a potential, invasion of that region by Ukrainian forces, which would essentially put NATO on the Ukrainian 12,000 mile border with Russia, which is the one thing Russia's really trying to prevent here, is to not share that massive border so close to their capital with Ukraine. I think, very rightly people have pointed out that if Russia had won the Cold War and was now building up on like the Mexican or Canadian border, Americans would be absolutely outraged and understand 100% why this would seem to be intolerable, which it absolutely is for the Russians. Now, there's also a possibility too here, Connor, that maybe Russia is looking to make some trade-offs, like, hey, we'll move some troops away from the border, but you guys got to take the warships out of the Black Sea or something like that. So, there are multiple levels of things that could be going on here. The Russians, for their part, have denied that they're going to invade Ukraine. And look, I know we shouldn't take the Russians at their word for that, but I really don't think that's the case, unless they really do think that the U.S. is going to make Ukraine a NATO ally member. Let's see. I think that's about all I had on the Ukraine issue. I think it's still at this point overblown by the U.S. media. But, one thing to say is it's not impossible that Russia wouldn't ever I don't know about like annex a chunk of Ukraine, but if Ukraine were to join NATO, if they were to really secure the Donbass region to see it as a more defensible position rather than allowing the Ukrainian government to take the whole territory. Now, interesting thing that happened this I think yesterday, Connor, is that the U.S. government announced further sanctions on Russia in connection with the Nord Stream pipeline. These sanctions are targeting, I think it's one Russian linked entity and then two ships that were involved in the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And so I guess what the U.S.'s now position is that they're going to continue to sanction people connected are involved on the Russian side, but not on the German side of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So they won't sanction the actual gas coming through once the pipeline is activated, but they are going to continue to punish anyone who is involved with the pipeline on the Russian side, it seems. Then the U.S. is currently upset with the Bulgarian president for saying that U.S. sanctions against Russia weren't working and acknowledging that in the status quo, the de facto situation is that the sanctions that were imposed because of Crimea and Ukraine are not yielding results, and Crimea is currently Russian. Right, that is what it is. He's just acknowledging reality, but of course when you are the world empire, you don't have to acknowledge reality, and you could get mad at your own allies for doing so. Last thing here, Connor, and it's a little bit of good news, possibly, and that is seems to be some diplomacy going on. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, who is not the person I would like to be heading the diplomacy with Russia, because this man is a fool and a problem, but at the same time, he did hold a call with the head of the Russian military, and so, maybe they could have some really frank and honest conversations about, like, look, you guys can't be flying your planes right along the Russian border all the time and stuff like that. And also now there's talk of a second summit between Biden and Putin, although there's no like detail or dates to this yet. And it's just an early report out of foreign policy. I don't know, Connor, if you got anything to weigh in on all that, just kind of try to catch up on the news and throw a lot out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know that the Americans, I guess last Friday, sent a strategic bomber up to the Russian border, about 12 and a half miles off of the Russian border. What seems to be happening is that you can't. I mean, I was just even reading a report about what those Turkish drones. I mean, Turkey was supplying those to Azerbaijan during the war in Nagorno-Karabakh last year, and 6,000 people. I thought I said 6,000 people were killed in the war, or if that was with the drones. But regardless, these are things that was used recently in a war. I mean, you can't just keep sending military equipment up into the region, arming the hell out of these. Like you said, I mean, we've had Nazis on Russia's border since 2014. Empowering Kiev essentially, and the history of all of that with vis-a-vis Russia, and you're just. I don't know. I mean, it's amazing to me. It still is amazing to me how the Democrats their politics change so drastically when it has to do with Russia, particularly since Russiagate and Trump, where they hate migrants and they support Nazis in Ukraine. I mean, it's absurd. And it's sort of it's similar to the situation in Taiwan. I mean, people just hear the news and they just assume that, well, Russia's going to invade Ukraine. And so, of course, I mean, they don't think of it this way, but we're the empire. We have to step in and do something about that. But if they did do that, as you say, it would be a result of these constant provocations and just kind of rolling the dice. Like, maybe we'll go to nuclear war, maybe we won't, but we're spending more in the military than we ever have. And it seems to be working so far. It's just it's really something that we have to be the American people really have to do something about this, because this situation could easily spiral out of control, as is the case in Taiwan. I mean, China considers Taiwan to be Chinese territory, and so when we're constantly now acknowledging that, hey, we've got American troops in Taiwan training their forces, and we're arming them more and more, and the American Congress wants to, like in the case of Ukraine, send them more and more American weapons and aid. It's you're basically saying, like, you put in the case of Taiwan, you put troops in China, and now they're preparing for war with who? With the Chinese, with Beijing. And when you're arming Ukraine and doing all these exercises, the Russians know exactly what that is. There's only one country in there on the Black Sea, except for Ukraine is essentially a NATO ally and everything but name, as Ted Galen Carpenter has said, and Georgia. That's another very dangerous situation. But you have people like Lloyd Austin saying, "Oh, the door's still open for you to be a part of NATO," and that kind of rhetoric has led to wars in the very recent past. So yeah, I don't know what the end game is, but this is a powder keg waiting to go off.
Yep.